I never imagined that my grandfather's well would spark a fierce dispute with the homeowners association until Margaret Wilson poured concrete into it while I was away. What she didn't realize was that I had been preparing a legal defense for months. How would you feel if you learned that your neighbor's issue with you went beyond simple property rules and tapped into a long-standing family feud? I can still picture the day I received the news about inheriting Grandpa Joe's farmhouse. The lawyer handed me a yellowed envelope, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. He said my grandfather had been very clear about wanting me to have this property. Inside, I found a hand-drawn map of 5 beautiful acres in Willow Creek Estates, complete with the stone well that had provided fresh water to the farm for over a century. As I traced my fingers over the rough paper, tears began to fill my eyes. Grandpa had taught me how to draw water from that well when I was just 8 years old. 2 months later, I moved into the farmhouse. It needed some repairs, but the land was stunning. The well stood proudly in the yard, its stone circle rising from the ground like something out of a storybook. I spent my first weekend clearing away weeds and fixing the wooden roof that protected it. My neighbors, the Thompsons, stopped by with a basket of muffins. "We're so glad someone is living here again," Sarah Thompson said. "Your grandfather was a wonderful man." I thanked them and offered water from the well. My first task was to test the water, which was still as pure as ever. David Thompson glanced nervously towards the street. "Just so you know, the HOA has gotten stricter lately. There's a new board member who's really pushing for rules," he warned. I chuckled and replied, "The HOA doesn't apply to this property. Grandpa made sure of that when they established it, and I have the original documents." The relief on their faces should have clued me in that something was off. 3 days later, while I was watering my vegetable garden, I noticed a shadow across the soil. Looking up, I saw a woman in an expensive tracksuit standing at my fence. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and despite the cloudy weather, she wore oversized sunglasses. "You must be Joe's grandchild," she said, without introducing herself. "I'm Margaret Wilson, the HOA board vice president." I stood up and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you." She wasted no time, declaring, "Your well is an eyesore." I took a deep breath, readying my response. "Actually, this property was established before the HOA, so it's exempt from those rules." Margaret's smile faded. "No property is exempt from maintaining community standards. I've already noted several violations." She took out her phone and snapped pictures of my yard. I stayed calm. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists. "I have legal documents," I said. "My grandfather made specific arrangements when our neighborhood was established. This well is both historically significant and my water source." She turned sharply, walking away, her expensive sneakers crunching on the gravel. That evening, a certified letter arrived. It stated I had 3 violations: unapproved exterior features, non-compliant landscaping, and unsafe structures. Each violation came with a potential $100 daily fine. I called the number listed and reached Thomas Reed, the HOA president. "I understand your concern," he said cautiously, "but Margaret is correct about the standards. If you have documentation of any exemption, please bring it to our next meeting." After we hung up, I searched through my grandfather's files in the old oak desk. I found the agreement from 1982, when Willow Creek Estates was first developed. It clearly listed his property as historically significant, with existing structures protected indefinitely. The next evening, I answered a knock at the door. It was Julia Johnson, an elderly neighbor from down the street. "I saw Margaret by your fence yesterday," she said quietly. "I need to warn you about her. Last year, while Roy and I were visiting our daughter, she filled in our koi pond, claiming it was a mosquito hazard. We had those fish for 20 years. My stomach turned. How could she do that without permission? "She waits until people are away, then claims it's an emergency," Julia continued, her hands shaking. "We tried to fight it, but the HOA supported her, saying we never had proper approval, even though the pond was there before the HOA rules." I invited Julia in for tea, and she shared more stories about our neighbors. Mr. Finch's garden shed was torn down, the the Parker family's play structure demolished, and the Rodriguez family forced to remove their traditional front gate. That night, sleep eluded me. I stepped outside with a flashlight and stood by the well, feeling the cool stones my grandfather had cared for so diligently. Margaret's intensity unsettled me, and I made a decision. The next morning, I contacted 3 people: a water rights attorney, a security company, and the State Historical Society. "Your grandfather's well might qualify for protection," they told me. A representative from the Historical Society mentioned that the hand-dug wells from the early settlement period are becoming quite rare. It's important for us to document them. On that same day, a security company set up cameras around my property. Some were visible, while others were hidden. Later, my attorney, Elaine Morales, reviewed my grandfather's documents. She assured me that his exemption was solid, but warned me that homeowners associations, HOAs, can be quite aggressive. She advised me to keep a detailed log of everything, every letter and every conversation. So I began maintaining a record that included photos of my property each day to prove its condition. I also printed hard copies of my grandfather's exemption agreement, placing one in my car, another in my bag, and a waterproof container near the well. In the following weeks, Margaret led a series of inspections past my house, and soon more violation notices arrived. When I presented the exemption documents at an HOA meeting, Margaret insisted they needed verification from the board's attorney. Around this time, I started receiving letters from my neighbors. Some expressed support for Margaret, while others encouraged me to stand my ground. One evening, the Thompsons brought dinner over. "She's dividing the neighborhood," Sarah whispered, "but many of us are tired of her bullying." David nodded in agreement, adding, "The Rodriguez family is fighting her too. She's even trying to make them repaint their house a neighborhood-approved color." I had to leave for a work trip the following week. Before I went, I checked all my cameras, secured the house, and asked the Thompsons to keep an eye on things. Something just didn't feel right. As I drove away, I reassured myself, telling myself I had done everything possible to protect my grandfather's legacy. The well had stood for 100 years, and I believed it could withstand the pressure from one power-hungry neighbor. Little did I know how wrong I was, or that Margaret Wilson was about to make a mistake that would give me what I needed to fight back. After what felt like a long week away, I returned home in pouring rain. All I craved was a hot shower and my own bed. As my headlights swept across the front yard, something unusual caught my eye where the well should have been. Something gray and solid. With urgency, I scrambled out of the car, rain soaking through my jacket. As I shone my flashlight on the scene, I was met with a nightmare. My grandfather's stone well had been filled in with a lumpy concrete plug. The wooden roof that I had cared for lay splintered nearby. "No, no, no," I muttered, dropping to my knees in the mud, my hands running over the rough surface. The concrete was completely hardened. Someone had intentionally filled in my well. As I clicked through the neighborhood app, I spotted Margaret Wilson on her porch, dressed in a bathrobe. Despite the distance, I could see her smile, which only fueled my anger. I made my way to her house, my frustration building inside me. "What did you do to my well?" I demanded. She remained calm, responding, "The board voted. That dangerous hole had to be addressed for everyone's safety. You ignored the notices. The well was exempt from HOA rules." She turned and went inside, returning with a folder labeled Emergency Action Provision, Section 8.3. This outlined that if a hazardous condition posed an immediate risk, the board could take corrective measures. She handed me a document filled with signatures. "We sent multiple notices. Your lack of action left us no choice." My hands trembled as I processed her words. I had only stepped away for a week, but her actions showed a neglect for community safety. "A child could have fallen in," I pointed out. She glanced at her watch, then curtly stated, "Any further concerns can be addressed at the next board meeting." With that, the door shut in my face. Feeling helpless, I called the police. Standing in the rain, I explained what had happened. The officer, though sympathetic, told me, "This is a civil matter between you and your HOA. You'll need to address it in court." That night, I spent hours reviewing my security footage. To my shock, there it was. Margaret directing a concrete truck onto my property the very day after I left. The driver appeared uncertain, but she waved papers at him and pointed firmly at the well. Two workers poured concrete directly into my water source, all under her watchful eye. The next morning, I went to see Thomas Reed, the HOA president. When I showed him the footage, he looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know they were actually going to fill it," he stammered. Margaret called an emergency meeting with just 3 board members. She claimed it was only for a safety cover installation. "But she destroyed my water source and a historical structure," I replied, my voice rising. Thomas glanced away, clearly uncomfortable. "The paperwork she presented mentioned a temporary safety measure pending your compliance, not concrete." Then I turned to my attorney. Elaine's eyes widened as she watched the footage. "This is far beyond the HOA's authority," she said, shaking her head. "Even with an emergency provision, permanently destroying a water source is illegal." She pulled out a thick law book. "And there's more. Your deed indicates riparian water rights that take precedence over HOA rules. Plus, the historical registration you filed last month." My thoughts raced at the mention of that registration. Yes, it was the key. "The paperwork you submitted to the State Historical Society was approved 3 days ago. Congratulations! Your well is now officially a protected historical site." Margaret's timing couldn't have been worse, and it hit me. My cautious preparations had set a trap for her. I had applied for historical protection weeks earlier, not expecting to need it so soon. Elaine continued, "She's not just liable for property damage. This constitutes criminal vandalism of a protected historical site. We'll file immediately." Later that day, I had 4 neighbors waiting at my door. Julia Johnson spoke first. "We saw what happened and want to help." The Rodriguez family had photos of Margaret measuring my well the day before the concrete truck arrived. Mr. Finch overheard her on the phone arranging the concrete delivery. Julia added, "Sarah Thompson questioned the workers, and they claimed they were doing emergency HOA work. She's gone too far this time. We're tired of being bullied." I decided to file a lawsuit naming both Margaret and the HOA. The next morning, my phone rang. Thomas Reed sounded panicked. "Several board members want to talk," he said. "Margaret showed us different paperwork than what was filed. We never authorized concrete." I was glad to hear they were willing to testify. It felt like things might finally be turning around. But then a brick crashed through my living room window with a note attached. "Drop the lawsuit or worse will happen." When the police officer responded, he seemed more interested in the threats. He noted that property destruction is a criminal matter and bagged the note for evidence. That evening, a local news van parked outside my house. The reporter had received an anonymous tip about HOA bullying. I hesitated, but then decided to speak. "I just want my grandfather's well restored," I told the camera. "It's not only my water source, but a piece of our community's history." The segment aired on the 10 News, and by morning, my phone was flooded with messages from other neighborhoods sharing their own HOA horror stories. Margaret's response was quick. Flyers appeared on every door in the neighborhood, claiming I was trying to destroy property values with my unsightly and dangerous water hole. Some neighbors began giving me cold stares, while others called to offer their support. I was retrieving my mail when Margaret approached, flanked by 2 large men. "You've made a serious mistake," she said. "The well wasn't known for being historically significant, or at least that's what my grandfather believed. However, the Historical Society had a different opinion." I tried to keep my cool and said, "Records can be changed, friends can be swayed, and accidents can happen." She gestured toward my house and remarked, "I've lived here for 20 years. You've been here for, 2 months?" One of the men stepped forward and announced, "The HOA has hired us to conduct daily safety inspections of all properties involved in litigation. We'll need access to your home." I firmly replied, "Not without a court order." Margaret's smile turned icy. "Oh, we'll get one. And when we do, who knows what violations we'll find inside. Enough to condemn this old place, I'd say." As they walked away, something caught my attention. A chill crept over me. None of the men were wearing any official identification, and one bore a tattoo that looked just like the handwriting on the brick note. I rushed inside and called Elaine. "Things are escalating," I explained. "I think Margaret just threatened me." "Document everything," she advised, and find somewhere else to stay tonight. I'm filing for an emergency hearing tomorrow. While I packed an overnight bag, I glanced at the well, now filled with concrete. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was evolving into something much more threatening. Margaret was more than just an HOA board member. She was willing to go further than I anticipated. Why was this well so important to her? What was she really afraid I might discover? I knew the answers would be buried deeper than I could imagine and might change everything I thought I knew about Willow Creek Estates. My hands trembled as I spread my grandfather's old papers across the kitchen table. Tears blurred my vision, but I pushed through. The concrete in the well hadn't completely dried yet, but my plan was already forming. Margaret picked the wrong person to mess with, I muttered as I dialed my phone. Elaine Parker answered on the third ring. We had met at a town hall meeting last year when I first started worrying about HOA issues. She had given me her card and some solid advice. Document everything. The concrete is still warm, I told her, my voice cracking, but I have something Margaret doesn't know about. About an hour later, Elaine sat at my table, her eyes widening as I presented my evidence. The State Historical Registry certificate I had obtained 3 months ago after hearing about the Johnson's Koi Pond disaster, the property survey showing the well's protected status, and crystal-clear security footage. Elaine watched as Margaret directed the concrete truck onto my property. "You've been preparing for this," she said, clearly impressed. "Most people only react after something happens." I nodded. My grandfather had always emphasized the importance of thinking ahead. When I started receiving those violation notices from Margaret, I sensed she might try something. Elaine pointed to a paragraph in my deed. She destroyed a historically protected water feature. "Look here. Your deed includes riparian water rights that take precedence over HOA authority." Hope surged within me as I asked, "What does that mean for me?" "It means Margaret has made a serious mistake," Elaine explained with excitement in her voice. "She's not just liable for property damage. This is criminal vandalism of a protected site. The fines alone could be significant." I hadn't expected such strong protection. "What's our next step?" "We file today," Elaine replied, gathering the necessary papers. "We'll name both Margaret and the HOA in the lawsuit. The board members will panic when they realize their personal assets could be at risk." By sunset, the paperwork was filed. A strange calm washed over me as I tended to my garden, contemplating the possibility of installing a modern well. The neighborhood felt unusually quiet. Word had spread quickly, and after dinner, my doorbell rang. Thomas Reed, the HOA president, stood on my porch, looking uneasy. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. "Can we talk?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. Not as HOA president, but as a neighbor who's worried. I invited him in, offering coffee, which he declined. "We never authorized concrete for your well," he whispered, leaning closer. He revealed that Margaret had shown the board different paperwork, something about temporary covers for inspection. Several members were willing to testify that she acted without proper approval. My heart raced. The plan was unfolding better than I had hoped. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas sighed heavily. "Because Margaret has a history of pushing boundaries. It started small, forcing color changes on mailboxes, making people remove bird baths. But it escalated. Last year, she had the Rodriguez family's heritage oak cut down while they were at a funeral." "That's horrible," I replied, genuinely shocked. "The board is divided on your well issue," Thomas continued. "Margaret claimed she had expert reports stating it was dangerous, but now we've discovered those reports don't exist." As Thomas left, he promised to bring other board members forward. The phone vibrated with a message from an unfamiliar number. "You think you're clever with your lawsuit. This is just the beginning." I took a screenshot, adding it to my evidence folder. Through my window, I could see Margaret talking to my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, and pointing toward my house. Margaret's expression showed determination rather than concern. "She has no idea what's coming," I whispered to myself. The next morning brought more updates. 3 additional HOA board members reached out to me, distancing themselves from Margaret's actions. My case was strengthening by the hour. Then Elaine called with important news. The judge had scheduled an emergency hearing due to the historical significance of the property damage. As dusk fell, I decided to visit my well one last time before the restoration team arrived the next day. The concrete had hardened, leaving a gray scar on my land. I placed my hand on it, feeling a connection to my grandfather despite the damage. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. Margaret stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed. "Enjoying your new landscape feature?" she said, a smirk on her face. "Actually, I'm about to enjoy something else," I replied calmly. "Did you know this well was registered with the State Historical Society?" Her smirk faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her stance. "That doesn't matter. The HOA has authority, not over historically protected landmarks," I explained. "You should check your mail. The court papers should have arrived by now." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Margaret's face, but she quickly stepped closer. "You're making a big mistake," she hissed. "I have friends in this town you've never even met. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you had just filled in this stupid hole yourself." As she stormed off, I realized the conflict was far from over. Margaret would not simply back down. She would escalate things, and oddly enough, I was somewhat prepared for that. By 7 a.m., bright yellow flyers appeared on every mailbox in Willow Creek Estates. I was stunned when I read the headline, "Emergency HOA Meeting. Resident Threatens Community Values with Frivolous Lawsuit." Margaret had acted quickly, painting me as an enemy of neighborhood harmony. The flyers claimed my unsightly well had decreased property values by 15%. Even more shocking was the bold lie at the bottom, stating my historical status was falsified with forged documents. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls from neighbors, some offering support while others condemned me. By noon, the community had clearly divided into opposing sides. "Don't let this discourage you," Elaine advised when I called her. "Margaret's panicking. These flyers actually work in our favor. They highlight her intent." I never expected what happened next. When I returned from the grocery store, I discovered my front yard filled with small signs that read "Comply or Leave" and "Wells Kill Property Values." A group of supporters, mostly newer residents who bought into Margaret's vision of a perfectly uniform neighborhood, stood across the street, watching for my reaction. Instead of pulling down the signs, I took pictures of them to add to my legal file. Then, I calmly walked inside. This seemed to disappoint the onlookers, who likely expected a dramatic response. Earlier, Thomas had advised me, "Don't engage with them. That's what Margaret wants. She wants to provoke you into looking unreasonable." Later that evening, there was a soft knock at my back door. To my surprise, it was Mrs. Jenkins, my 78-year-old neighbor, looking anxious. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, "but you need to know what Margaret's planning." She went on to explain that Margaret had held a private meeting with her closest allies and hired someone to check if my historical registration had been backdated. "And she's spreading the rumor that you threatened her physically. That's completely false," I gasped. "I know, dear. That's why I'm here," Mrs. Jenkins said, patting my hand gently. She shared a story about her own run-ins with Margaret, recalling how last year she tried to make her get rid of the rose garden her late husband had planted because the roses weren't on the approved plant list. I've watched her bully people for 3 years now. After Mrs. Jenkins left, I went to check on my dog, Max, in the backyard. My heart sank when I realized he was missing. The gate was still latched. We searched for hours, calling for him throughout the neighborhood, while Margaret's supporters observed from their porches, eerily quiet. Then I received a text at midnight from the Johnsons. "Check Margaret's shed. We saw her dragging something there earlier." My heart raced as I called Officer Rivera, who had taken my earlier reports. "I just need to check the shed," I explained. When Margaret answered the door, wearing a bathrobe and pretending to be sleepy, her makeup was still flawless. "This is harassment," she protested, as Officer Rivera explained he had reasonable cause. When we opened the shed door, Max rushed out, dehydrated but otherwise fine. Margaret quickly jumped in with her excuse. "He was digging in my yard. I was going to call animal control in the morning." Officer Rivera looked skeptical, narrowing his eyes through the locked gate. The incident changed how people in the neighborhood viewed the situation. Security cameras from the Johnsons' house had captured Margaret trying to lure Max with treats before taking him to her shed. This footage became a key part of my growing case file. The emergency HOA meeting that Margaret scheduled ultimately backfired for her. The community center buzzed with tension as neighbors from both sides filled the seats. Margaret was the first to speak. She presented enlarged photos of my well, calling it both dangerous and unattractive. Speaking confidently about HOA regulations and property values, she occasionally shot me glances filled with disdain. She argued, "This lawsuit threatens every homeowner here. If one person can disregard our standards, soon we'll have junk cars and chicken coops, ruining our reputable community." When it was my turn to speak, I chose not to attack Margaret. Instead, I calmly shared historical documents, including original property maps showing the well's significance and photos of similar preserved features in high-value neighborhoods. "This isn't about defiance," I explained. "It's about preserving history while respecting community standards. My grandfather's well has provided water here for a century." Then Thomas asked to speak. Margaret, anticipating his support, wore a confident smile. However, her expression quickly changed when he revealed side-by-side documents, what she had shown the board versus what she had actually ordered the concrete company to do. "The board never approved filling the well with concrete," Thomas stated. "These documents were altered after we added our signatures." Gasps filled the room as Margaret lunged for the papers, but Thomas stepped back. He continued, "The HOA is severing ties with Mrs. Wilson and fully supports the restoration of the historical well. We've also voted to help cover the restoration costs since our insurance won't pay for unauthorized actions." Margaret's face turned crimson as she grabbed her purse and pushed through the crowd. "This isn't over," she muttered as she passed by my seat. "You have no idea what's coming next." After the meeting, I stayed behind to accept apologies from neighbors who had placed signs in my yard. Mr. Finch, the Johnsons, and several others shared their own stories of Margaret's bullying. A pattern of escalating control and retaliation against anyone who opposed her became clear. On my drive home, my car felt unusually unresponsive. I pulled over and called my mechanic friend, who arrived quickly, his face turning grim as he assessed the situation. As he looked closely, he quietly said, "Someone cut your brake lines." He noted that it had happened recently, as fluid continued to drip while the police took photographs and collected evidence. I glanced toward Margaret's house, where a single light shone in an upstairs window. Our disagreement had escalated into a serious matter. Was she really willing to put my life at risk over a century-old well? With the court hearing just 2 days away, I started to worry about what other lines she might cross. The bailiff's voice rang out, calling for everyone to rise as Judge Reynolds entered. My heart raced, making it hard to hear Elaine quietly reassuring me beside me. Across the aisle, Margaret sat with her high-priced lawyer, her confident demeanor twisting my stomach. "I've reviewed the initial filings," Judge Reynolds said, peering over her glasses. "Let me be clear, this is one of the most disturbing property disputes I've seen in 15 years on the bench." Elaine stood, walking toward the judge with our binder of evidence. "Your Honor, what started as a simple HOA disagreement took a dangerous turn when Miss Wilson took matters into her own hands." Gasps filled the courtroom as Elaine showed the security footage, revealing Margaret directing workers to pour concrete into my well at 5:30 a.m. The timestamp was clear. She claimed she had proper authorization, Margaret's attorney argued, as an HOA board member with emergency authority. "That's false," interrupted Thomas Reed, who was called to testify. "I was the board president, and no such emergency vote took place." 3 other board members backed Thomas's statement, explaining that Margaret had shown them different documents from those she had filed. Our hired forgery expert pointed out the altered documents, displaying them side by side on the courtroom screen. With each piece of evidence, Margaret's face flushed deeper. When her lawyer whispered something to her, she shoved him away forcefully, causing his water glass to topple. Elaine continued, presenting the historical registry paperwork to illustrate that the well was a protected landmark, registered 3 months prior to the incident. Then came the big reveal. The police detective investigating my cut brake lines announced, "We found Miss Wilson's fingerprints on the undercarriage of the plaintiff's vehicle, and security footage from a neighbor shows her approaching the car at 2:13 a.m., just 48 hours after she received notice of this lawsuit. Margaret exploded. "He's been tormenting me for months. That well ruins property values." As Judge Reynolds struck her gavel, she clearly stated, "Miss Wilson, control yourself, or I will have you removed." During the lunch break, I heard whispers from neighbors in the hallway. "We had no idea she altered those documents," Mrs. Johnson confided. "She did something similar with our pond, claiming it was a mosquito breeding ground." When court reconvened, Margaret's lawyer shifted tactics. "My client may have acted impulsively, but she genuinely believed she was acting in the community's best interest. The plaintiff has a history of non-compliance." Elaine interjected vehemently, "There is no record of any legitimate violation." Judge Reynolds agreed with her and posed an unexpected question. "Miss Wilson, did you consult with the water authority before filling a registered well with concrete?" Margaret hesitated. "I thought that wasn't necessary for an eyesore." The judge clarified, "A functioning well isn't just property, it's a matter of water rights. By destroying it, you've infringed upon legally established riparian rights." The court ultimately ruled in favor of the plaintiff. The judgment exceeded my hopes. Full restoration costs of $175,000, punitive damages, Margaret's removal from the HOA board, and a restraining order keeping her 100 feet away from my property. As people began to leave, I noticed Margaret pushing through the crowd toward me. 2 sheriff's deputies moved to block her, but she shouted over them, "You think you've won? Your precious grandfather wasn't who you think. Ask about the Henderson property deal in '76. He wasn't so innocent." I froze at the mention of Henderson. I'd never connected that name to my grandfather. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around me. "How does it feel to win against the HOA?" one asked. I replied, "This isn't about winning. It's about standing up to bullying and the abuse of power." Cameras flashed as I scanned the crowd and spotted an elderly man across the street, leaning heavily on a cane. Our eyes met, and he nodded slowly before turning away. There was something familiar about his face, like a faint memory. Curious, I pulled out my phone and typed "Henderson property deal" into the county records database. My third cup of coffee sat forgotten, growing cold beside me. For 2 weeks after the trial, Margaret's final words lingered in my mind, haunting my dreams. The restoration crew was set to start removing the concrete tomorrow, yet I felt there was more to uncover. A sudden knock on my door startled me. I peered through the peephole and saw an elderly man standing outside. His name was Frank Henderson. When I opened the door just enough to keep the security chain in place, he introduced himself, mentioning that Margaret Wilson had spoken about my family. I felt a wave of anxiety. How did he even find me? Frank explained that he and my grandfather had been business partners 60 years ago. He noticed my resemblance to my grandfather when he saw me on the news. Against my better judgment, I let him inside. Frank moved deliberately, placing a worn leather folder on my kitchen table. He began to share his story. "Your grandfather saved my family farm during the drought of 1976. We were turned down by every bank for a loan, but he stepped in to finance our irrigation system." I was curious about Margaret's role in all of this, so I asked him what she had mentioned at the courthouse. He sighed, revealing that her family had spread rumors claiming my grandfather had swindled them. "That couldn't be further from the truth," he said. Frank explained that when her father's questionable banking practices were on the verge of being uncovered, my grandfather had agreed not to testify if they left his family alone. While I processed Frank's revelations, the sound of drilling outside filled the air. My phone rang. It was Thomas Reed, the former HOA president. "You need to come quickly," he said, his voice shaky. "The workers found something." I rushed outside to see a small crowd gathering around the well. As they removed the concrete, they uncovered a waterproof metal box carefully wedged into a side chamber. The foreman handed it to me, saying that it was impressive craftsmanship to hide something like that. When I opened the box, I found title deeds, bank records, and photographs. My hands shook as I examined the documents. They showed that my grandfather had sold land to Margaret's parents, with specific conditions attached. Natural features couldn't be removed, historical structures had to be preserved, and if those conditions were violated, the water rights would revert to my family. "There's more," Thomas said, pointing to the bank records. These indicate her father was embezzling money from his own bank, using rural properties as collateral without the owners knowing. I immediately called Elaine. We need to head back to court, I explained. The covenants in these deeds mean Margaret's claim to her property isn't valid. Word spread quickly. By the afternoon, reporters camped outside my house. In response, Margaret's attorney released a statement dismissing the documents as convenient fabrications. Yet the county clerk confirmed their authenticity. Margaret had stamped those documents herself nearly half a century ago. Just 3 days later, we found ourselves before Judge Reynolds once more. Margaret appeared weary and defeated next to her new lawyer. Your Honor, Elaine started, these documents explain why Miss Wilson targeted my clients. It wasn't just about HOA overreach. It was part of an effort to cover up her family's questionable property acquisition. As she spoke, the courtroom buzzed with intrigue while she presented the deeds, which clearly showed the covenants. Elaine continued, by damaging natural features, like my client's well, the Johnson's pond, and 6 other historic elements, these covenants were violated. Margaret's attorney responded, desperate to defend her. My client had no idea about these ancient agreements. She bought her home in good faith. But, Elaine pointed out, the property records indicate her father transferred the house to her via a family trust. She signed documents acknowledging all encumbrances. Judge Reynolds listened attentively, reviewing the evidence presented. The court finds these covenants binding and enforceable. The willful violations nullify Miss Wilson's ownership claim. When the judge delivered this verdict, Margaret broke down in tears. He added that the criminal charges regarding the break and tampering would continue separately, but this civil matter had reached a resolution. Miss Wilson had 30 days to vacate the property. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered around me, asking questions and offering support. Frank Henderson stood on the periphery. Your grandfather always said, justice might sleep, but it never dies, he remarked. He had saved those documents, fully aware they would someday become vital. In the months that followed, significant changes took place. To avoid jail time for her actions, Margaret pleaded guilty to criminal mischief, and as part of her sentence, she cataloged historical features in the neighborhood for preservation. The HOA opted to dissolve, creating instead a heritage committee that focused on safeguarding unique property elements rather than enforcing conformity. My well was designated a historical landmark, complete with a small plaque explaining its significance. When the newly restored well pumped its first clean water, neighbors gathered for a spontaneous celebration. Thomas approached me with an envelope. We found this taped behind the HOA charter, he informed me. It's addressed to whoever owns your property. Inside was a letter from my grandfather, dated 40 years earlier. To whom it may concern, it read, if you're reading this, someone has likely challenged the well's existence. Water brings life, but also reveals truth. Life has a way of revealing what's hidden at unexpected moments. Sometimes what we think is lost is just lying in wait, ready to come back into our lives when the time is right. It's important to protect what truly matters, rather than just what looks good on the surface. I often find myself reflecting on these thoughts, especially when I'm with my neighbors by the well that connects us all. In those moments, I realize that our greatest inheritances aren't necessarily material things. Instead, they are the strength to stand firm for what we believe in and the insight to discern which conflicts are truly worth our energy. Have you ever thought about what you cherish the most? What gives you the strength to stand your ground? It's these values that shape our lives and our connections with others.